We're here at the Oklahoma State University swine farm here where they do research in swine production, and they come here and do some class exercises out here. But before we go into these barns and show you how swine production takes place on most farms in the U.S. today, I want to talk a little bit about swine in history and why a lot of hogs are raised inside of barns instead of, say, in a pasture like this. If you look back in history, almost any way you could think of raising a hog, people have raised hogs in that way. If you go back to ancient Egypt, there's some evidence that people raised hogs in small kennels like we have today in small confined spaces. There's also evidence that Egyptians had kind of free-range swine. When they planted grain, sometimes they would throw the grain seeds on the ground and then run the swine over those seeds, and the swine's feet would tap the seeds into the ground as a way of helping them plant grain. In colonial America, there was so much wilderness around the farm that a lot of farmers would just let their hogs loose, and the hogs would go out into the woods, find acorn, roots, everything they needed on their own to eat. And then the colonists would go out to the woods about once or twice a year, round them up, maybe shoot them like you would hunting a deer, and so essentially they got pork for free that way. In 19th century New York, there was something called street hogs, and it's exactly what it sounds like. There were hogs roaming the streets of New York, not owned by anybody, and they went around eating anything they could find, and it actually helped the city keep clean in many ways. Some butchers would, after they were through slaughtering an animal and they had things like the head and the guts they needed to get rid of, they could just go to the back door, throw it on the ground, and leave it there, knowing street hogs would eventually come and clean it all up and eat it for them. And today there are still something like street hogs. In, let's go to modern Egypt now, there are Coptic Christians who take a lot of the garbage that the cities get rid of, and they go through it and find renewables to sort out and sell for money. They also find uneaten food and they feed it to their hogs. So we've raised hogs a lot of different ways. Let me talk a little bit about hogs and say why you won't see hogs in pastures much anymore. The thing to know about hogs is that they're not necessarily mean, but they are very stubborn, and they can get a little ornery. It's hard to get them to do what they do not want to do. You can't say herd pigs like you do cattle or like you do sheep. The best way to get them to go somewhere is to lure them with food. And if you took a hog and put them out in the pasture like this, a number of things would happen. First, they would get out immediately. This just isn't strong enough to keep in a hog. They're going to look for any weakness in a fence and get out. And also, all this grass you see here, which in summer would be green, within a few weeks they would turn that into a World War I no man's land, because they love to dig. They will dig holes all over this pasture and just tear it up. And so because they're hard to handle, because they're hard to contain, and because they tear up the ground, most people today keep them in buildings like the buildings we're going to see. And you're going to see a lot of strong materials, a lot of steel, a lot of concrete. That's because the hogs are so hard to handle. That being said, let's go and see how most hog production takes place in the U.S. today.
In this virtual tour, we are going to see how the vast majority of the hogs in the U.S. are raised. We're going to begin with the first 3 weeks in a baby pig's life and study how both the mother and her babies are cared for in a farrowing crate system. Then we will visit the nursery, where piglets are taken when they are weaned at about 3 weeks of age and nurtured until 9 weeks of age. After that comes the finishing stage, the last stage of production for hogs that will be sent directly to slaughter at close to 30 weeks of age. After the finishing stage, those females reserved for breeding will be bred and kept in gestation crates until they are ready to give birth, after which she will return to the farrowing crate, this time as the mother. So long as the sow is in good health and reproduces efficiently, she will remain in the herd, but will probably be sent to slaughter sometime between 1 and 3 years of age.
After the sow has been gestating for 3 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days, she'll be taken to a farrowing house, much like this one, and placed in a farrowing crate. And this is where she'll give birth and nurse her piglets for about 3 weeks. The design of these crates is done mainly to protect the piglet. You'll notice that the sow can't turn around, she can't really move forward or back, and it's designed such that when the sow is in a standing position and then goes to lay down, she has to do so very carefully, very slowly, and slow is the key because that gives her piglets the time to get out of the way. If she had given birth in a pasture setting or a more open setting, a lot of sows will be rather neglectful of their young, and they'll lie down quickly and they'll crush a number of their pigs. This reduces crushing by a lot. And also some sows can be rather neglectful mothers. They won't want to nurse their young, but in this crate, she has to. She'll lay down most of her day, and when she does, the piglets have free rein to suck her udder. She'll give birth to about 10 piglets, and usually there'll be 10 of those that are weaned in the end. And you'll notice that most of the farrowing crate is a slatted floor. And it's done that so the manure and urine will be separated from both the piglets and the mothers, and so that the piglets will not come into contact with the manure from any of the other pigs here. This helps reduce the spread of sickness and disease. Now, of course, on a hard slatted floor, there's not much comfortable spots to lie on, but the farrows do have a nice, comfortable little mat that they can lie on there. One nice feature of the farrowing crate is that it really helps the farmers monitor and help the sow give birth. Chances are, if you were one of these pigs being born, you might be born right into a farm worker's hands. When they see her go into labor, they can come right here, have easy access to the sow, and can help make sure the sow give birth fine. And when they're first born, especially if the weather's cold, there'll be heat lamps at some part here where the piglets can go to the heat lamp when they're cold and leave the heat lamp when they're too warm. Now, this farm doesn't need heat lamps because those mats that you saw, the comfortable spot for them to lie on, those are heated. So they not only have a soft spot, but a very warm spot for them to lie on. In the first 2 or 3 days of life, they'll have a few minor surgeries performed on them. One, they'll get an iron shot to help prevent anemia. Second, they may have some of the ears notched, made little notches carved out of them. Those notches refer to numbers. Each notch refers to a number. If you put all the notches together, that corresponds to a string of numbers. That's the animal's identification that the farm can use to keep track of the baby's health and how it's doing throughout its life. Males will be castrated in the first few days of life. The tails will be docked. That way, when they get older, other pigs won't gnaw on the tails like they will do out of boredom sometimes. And it used to be farmers would cut the needle teeth out of pigs at a young age. They don't do that here anymore, and farms are kind of getting away from it. And so here you can see the notches, and the tail's been docked a little. And after about 3 weeks of age, then it's time to wean them and take them to the nursery. At 3 weeks of age, the piglets are going to be weaned, at which point they're brought here, and this is what you call a nursery. And they'll stay in the nursery from 3 weeks of age till 9 weeks of age. This is a very important part of the pig's development because they're just weaned, so they're a little stressed from that, and they're at a young age when their immune system is vulnerable. So these houses are kept especially clean. They use something called an all-in, all-out system, where before these piglets are brought in, the whole building, all the pigs are taken out of the building and the whole thing is cleaned and sanitized. And then they bring a whole new group of pigs in so they come straight into a very clean environment. And you can see there are slats in the floor here, just like you'll see everywhere. That's for the manure to go through and keep the pigs separate from the manure, keeps them clean. And it's very cold outside, but it's warm in here. And every barn you see is going to be temperature controlled, comfortable in summer, comfortable in winter, because that's what keeps the pigs healthy and keeps them growing. And you see, they're given enough room. They have plenty of room to move around. and they have all the feed that they can possibly eat here, and of course all the water they want as well. They're a little skittish in here because they're not used to people getting in the pen with them. That rarely happens. I just did it because I like them and I wanted to get close to them. But most of the time the humans will be outside the pen, and then the hogs will settle down and get back to their normal activities of playing with the chain, drinking water, and eating. This is what the nursery looks like before the pigs come in. They've taken all the other pigs out, the room's empty, and then they come in and they sterilize everything, wash everything thoroughly. This barn is 10 years old, and look how clean it looks. That way when the new group of pigs come in, there are no germs around. There's very little for them to get sick. It's the best environment for their health, and you're going to find that this all-in, all-out system takes place not only in the nursery, but in the finishing and also the farrowing stage. And after 6 weeks in here, it's time for them to go to the finishing floor, and that's where we'll go next. Okay. When the piglets are 9 weeks old and about 60 pounds, they'll be taken out of the nursery and brought here onto what they call the finishing floor. And they call it the finishing floor because this is the last stage of hog production. And this will be like the pen where they are, and you can see they get their water from right here, and the feed comes in through there. And because these are growing fast, they get all the feed they want, a very scientifically formulated diet. As you can see at this stage, they're very different than the nursery pigs. They're not scared of people as much. They're actually trying to eat my hand a little, so they're much more comfortable around people. And they'll stay here until they're 6 months of age, at which point they'll be about 275 pounds, and then that's when they're ready to be harvested for meat.
So far we have seen the baby pigs who are nursing from their mother for the first 3 weeks of their life. Then we saw the nursery, where the piglets are weaned and cared for until they are 9 weeks of age. After the nursery comes the finishing stage. Virtually all the males will then be slaughtered at around 28 weeks of age, and so will the females not reserved by the farmer for breeding. Those females that are reserved for breeding then become mothers. They will usually have between 3 to 5 litters before they too are slaughtered for meat, sometime between 1 and 3 years of age. What happens to the females reserved for breeding after the finishing stage? We have already seen the buildings where they give birth and nurse their offspring. What we haven't seen is how the females are cared for while they are in gestation, and that is where we will go now. Once a sow has conceived for the first time, or once her piglets have been weaned, she's moved to a gestation crate. Those are the crates you see here. And here's a story of how we got to gestation crates. Farmers learned that it's better to keep pigs indoors off the ground, because if you have them out in pastures, they dig a lot. They're going to dig in their own feces, other pigs' feces, and because they're near the ground, they get infected with parasites and worms very easy. But the sows are much healthier if the farmer can bring them in a barn like this and keep them separate from manure, keep the temperature comfortable, and keep them off the ground. But it's expensive to build these buildings for hog production, so the farmer's going to want to put as many hogs as he can under one building. But the problem is, if you start piling lots of sows in really cramped conditions in a building, they get really ornery and they start injuring one another, fighting each other. And so that's why these gestation crates were developed. As you can see, each sow goes into her own gestation crate. It's slightly larger than her own body. She can move forward a little, back a little, but there's not even enough room for her to turn around. This allows the farmer to keep a lot of hogs in one building without them hurting each other. Another thing it does is that it allows the farmer to feed each sow individually. You see, sows at their age, if you let them eat as much as they want, they'll eat too much. They'll become far too obese. And so the farmer needs to make sure they get just the right amount of feed. But if you feed them in groups, what will happen is one sow, a dominant sow, will take food from subordinate pigs. And so that dominant sow will get too much to eat, but the subordinate pigs will not get enough to eat. And so feeding each of them individually in this gestation crate allows the farmer to get each sow the precise feed that it needs. Another thing to recognize about the gestation crates is that it makes it so much easier for the farmer to handle the sow when she needs to do something like give it a shot or artificially inseminate it. If you had sows out in an open lot, getting a sow separated from the other sows and into a tight space where you could say give it a shot can be really difficult. Sows can be very difficult to handle. But having them in the gestation crate like this, if you need to give them a shot, you just walk to the gestation crate, give it to them, and walk away. Nothing to it. It also makes it much easier for farmers to hire people with very little experience managing hogs to work in these buildings, because when they're in the gestation crates, you don't need to have much experience with hogs to be able to handle them. And so this allows farmers to employ more unskilled labor on hog farms and cheaper labor as well. Shortly before giving birth, the sow will be moved from her gestation crate to a farrowing crate. And then after those piglets that she gives birth to are weaned, she'll be moved from the farrowing crate back into the gestation crate. So from around the time the pig is 6 months old, around the time she first conceives, the rest of her life is going to be spent in a gestation crate or a farrowing crate.